Hi, Susan. How are you? Susan says, just got home from canvassing to Berlin, New Hampshire. My legs are ready to fall off. Well, put your feet up, Susan. And Dolores Pierce says, hi, all. Susan says, just got home from canvassing to Berlin, New Hampshire. And Jason Bessie joined as well. Thank you for coming, Jason. And of course, Susan and also Dolores. And Robin Halsey, thank you for coming. And Rob Rivera, good to see you, Rob. And Susan meant to say Bernie in New Hampshire. Rob says, hey Yoda. Okay, so I will not keep you in suspense much longer. Okay, so can everybody hear me okay? I hope so. Please let me know. Rob says, I just started reading Reclaiming the State by Bill Mitchell. Yeah, I know. I've got the book too. It's a good book. It's a good book. I bought not a Kindle version, but an EPUB version of it. Susan says, yes, she can hear, but there's a slight echo. How's that, Susan? Is the echo a little less? Rob says, sounds great. So let me know if it's good for you yet, Susan. How's that, Susan? Is the echo a little less? Rob says, sounds great. So let me know if it's good for you yet. Okay, so tonight, a slight repeat, she said. I don't know what could be causing that. Let me see something. Oh, here we go. Try this. How's that? That better? I had the sound on in the Facebook broadcast in my browser, which is not supposed to be the case since I'm using a mic. Are you still hearing the repeat? Yes, you're still hearing the repeat. Oh, yes, I improved it. Okay. Good. Okay. So let's get on with it now. I'm going to share the article this one is based on. And it's an article by Ellen Brown that I picked up in Truthdig. Let me get there. There you go. Her version of the title is The Key to a Sustainable Economy is 5,000 years old. And Ellen Brown published this in Truthdig on August 28th of 2019. I think you'll also find it over at the Web of Debt blog, which is Ellen's blog. You see the nice photo of it's either the Sumerians or the Babylonians there. Anyway, she points out we are again reaching the point in the business cycle known as peak debt, when debts have compounded to the point that the cumulative total cannot be paid. Student debt, credit card debt, loans for cars, business debt, and sovereign debt are all higher than they have ever been. As economist Michael Hudson writes in his 2018 book, quote, and forgive them their debts, unquote. I think somebody else said that way before Michael Hudson, didn't they? But Michael also said, debts that can't be paid won't be paid. I think somebody else said that too before Michael. But anyway, the question he says is how they won't be paid. And Allen says that mainstream economic models leave this problem to the, quote, invisible hand of the market, unquote, assuming trends are going to self-correct over time. But while the market may indeed correct, it does so at the expense of the debtors who become uh, um, progressively poorer as the rich become richer. Borrowers go bankrupt and banks foreclose on the collateral, dispossessing the debtors of their homes and their livelihoods. The houses are bought by the rich at distressed prices and are rented back at inflated prices to the debtors, who were then forced into into wage peonage to survive. When the banks themselves go bankrupt, the government bails them out. Thus, the market corrects, but not without government intervention. That intervention just comes at the end of the cycle to rescue the creditors, whose ability to buy politicians gives them the upper hand. Okay, and further, according to free market apologists, this is a natural cycle akin to the weather, which dates all the way back to the birth, the birth, okay, of modern economics in ancient Greece and Rome. Doesn't sound too modern to me. Hudson counters that those classical societies are not actually where our financial system began, and that capitalism did not evolve from bartering, as its ideologies assert. Rather, it devolved from a more functional, sophisticated, egalitarian credit system that was sustained for 2 millennia, that's 2,000 years, in ancient Mesopotamia, now parts of Iraq, Turkey, Kuwait, okay, and Iran. Okay, money banking and accounting and modern business enterprise originated not with gold and private trade, but in the public sector of Sumer's palaces and temples in the 3rd century BC, because it involved credit. I think she meant to say the not the 3rd century BC, but actually the 3rd millennia BC. The third century would be far too modern because we'd already be almost at Greece, okay, in modern times. And Sumer was also not very prominent in the third century BC, which, if I remember my ancient history correctly, was the time of the Medes and the Persians. I think that Babylon had fallen by then, or was very soon to fall. Because it involved the credit issued by the local government rather than private loans of gold, bad debts could be periodically forgiven rather than compounding until they took the whole system down. This was a critical feature that allowed for the remarkable the longevity of the Sumerian and also Babylonian systems. And Ellen goes on, the true roots of money and banking, and she says Sumer was the first civilization for which we have written by records. Its notable achievements included the wheel, not the whale, the wheel, the lunar calendar, our numerical system, law codes, an organized hierarchy of priest kings, copper tools and weapons, irrigation, accounting, and money. It also produced the first written language, which took the form of cuneiform figures impressed on clay. And these tablets were largely just accounting tools, recording the flow of food and by food and by raw materials in the temple and palace workshops, as well as IOUs, mainly to these large public institutions that had to be preserved in writing to be enforced. This temple accounting system allowed for coordinated flow of credit to peasant farmers from planting to harvesting, and for advances to merchants to engage in foreign trade. In fact, says Ellen, it was the need to manage accounts for a large labor force under bureaucratic control that is thought to have led to the development of writing. The people willingly accepted this bureaucratic control because they viewed the gods as having decreed it. Okay? According to their cuneiform writings, humans were genetically engineered to work the fields and the mines after certain lower gods tasked with that hard labor rebelled, I presume, against the higher gods. By usury, or the charging of interest on loans, was an accepted part of the Mesopotamians' credit system. Interest rates were high and remained unchanged for 2 millennia, 2,000 years. But the Mesopotamian scholars were well aware of the problem of debts that can't be paid, unlike in today's academic economic curriculum. But Michael Hudson writes, quote, Babylonian scribal students were trained already circa 2000 BC in the mathematics of compound interest. Their school exercises asked them to calculate how long it took a debt at interest of 1/60th per month to double. The answer is 60 months, 5 years. How long to quadruple? 10 years. How long to multiply 64 times? 30 years. It must have been obvious that no economy can grow in keeping with this rate of increase, of debt. Sumerian kings solved the problem of peak debt by periodically declaring, quote, clean slates, unquote, in which by the agrarian debts were forgiven and debtors were released from servitude to work as tenants on their own plots of land. The land actually belonged to the gods under the stewardship of the temple and the palace and could not be sold. But farmers and their families maintained the leaseholds to it in perpetuity by providing a share of their crops, the service in the military, and labor in building communal infrastructure. In this way, their homes and livelihoods were preserved, an arrangement that was a mutually beneficial one, since the kings needed their service. Jewish scribes who spent time in captivity in Babylon in the 6th century BC adapted these laws. In the year of Jubilee, which Hudson argues was added to Leviticus after the Babylonian captivity. And according to Leviticus 25:8-13, the Jubilee year was to be declared every 49 years. 7 times 7, every 7 times 7, 49 years, during which debts would be forgiven, slaves and prisoners freed, and their property leaseholds restored. As in ancient Mesopotamia, property ownership remained with Yahweh and his earthly proxies. The Jubilee law effectively banned the outright sale of land, which could only be leased for up to 50 years. And there's a reference, to Leviticus 25:14-17. The Levitican Jubilee represented an advance over the Mesopotamian clean slates, Hudson says, in that the Jubilee was codified into law rather than relying on the whim of the king. But its proclaimers lacked political power, and whether the law was ever enforced is unclear. It served as a moral rather than a legal prescription. Ancient Greece and Rome adopted the Mesopotamian system of lending at interest, but without the safety valve of periodic, quote, clean slates, unquote, since the creditors were no longer the king or the temple, but were private lenders. So usury that was unfettered resulted in debt bondage and forfeiture of the properties, consolidation into large land holdings, a growing wedge between the rich and the poor, and the ultimate destruction of the Roman Empire. As for the celebrated development of property rights and democracy in ancient Greece and Rome, Hudson argues they did not actually serve the poor. they served the rich who controlled elections, just as rich donors do today, taking power away from local governments by privatizing one's communal lands, allowed private creditors to pass laws by which they could legally confiscate property when their debtors could not pay. Quote, free markets meant the freedom to accumulate massive wealth at the expense of the poor and the state. Hudson maintains that when Jesus Christ preached the forgiveness of debts, he was also talking about economic debt, not just the moral transgressions. When he overturned the tables of the money changers, it was because they had turned a house of prayer into a den of thieves, quote unquote. But creditors' rights had by then gained legal dominance, and Christian theologians lacked the power to override them. Rather than being a promise of economic redemption in this life, forgiveness of debts, thus became a promise of a spiritual redemption in the next. In other words, when you died and you crossed the golden bridge, then your debts would be forgiven. So now Ellen tells us how to pull off a modern debt jubilee. And she says, such has been the fate of debtors in modern Western economies. But in some of the modern non-Western economies, vestiges of the debt write-off solution remain. Excuse me. In China, for instance, non-performing loans are often carried on the books of state-owned banks or canceled, rather than putting insolvent debtors and banks into bankruptcy. As Dinny McMahon wrote in June in an article titled, quote, China's bad data can be a good thing, unquote, colon, quote, from Dinny McMahon. In China, the state stands behind the country's banks as long as authorities ensure those banks have sufficient liquidity to meet their obligations. They can trundle along with higher delinquency levels than would be regarded safe in a market economy. Chinese banking system, unquote, I should say. China's banking system, like that of ancient Mesopotamia, is largely in the public sector. So the state can back its banks with liquidity as needed. Interestingly, the Chinese state also preserves the ancient Near Eastern practice of retaining ownership of the land, which citizens can only lease for a period of time. Now, that was something I did not know about China at this point. In Western economies, most banks are privately owned and heavily regulated with high reserve and capital requirements. Bad loans mean debtors are put into foreclosure, jobs and capital infrastructure are lost, and austerity prevails. The Trump administration is now aggressively pursuing a trade war with China in an effort to level their playing field by forcing it into the same austerity regime. But a more productive and sustainable approach might be for the U.S. to engage in periodic debt jubilees itself. A great suggestion by Ellen Brown. The problem with that solution today is that most debts in Western economies are owed not to the government but to private creditors who will insist on their contractual rights to payment. We need to find a way to pay the creditors while relieving the borrowers of their debt burden. Would that have been a great thing if the debtors were bailed out in this way after the crash of 2008? Of course, it would have been a great thing. Ellen says one possibility is to nationalize insolvent banks and sell their bad loans to the central bank, which can buy them with money created on its books. The loans can then be written down or voided out. Precedent for this policy was established with QE1, the Fed's first round of quantitative easing, in which it bought unmarketable mortgage-backed securities from banks that had liquidity problems. Another possibility would be to use money generated by the central bank to bail out the debtors directly. This could be done selectively by buying up student debt or credit card debt or car loans bundled as asset-backed securities, then writing the debts down or off, for example. Alternatively, debts could be relieved collectively with a periodic national dividend or universal basic income that was paid to everyone, again drawn from the deep pocket of the central banks. Critics will object that this would dangerously inflate the money supply and consumer prices, but that need not be the case. Today, virtually all money is created as bank debt, and it is extinguished when the debt is repaid. Yes, the principal is distinguished. That means dividends used to pay this debt down would be extinguished along with the debt itself without adding to the money supply. Only the payments of interest would add to the money supply, of course. For the 80% of the U.S. population now carrying debt, loan repayments from their national dividends could be made mandatory and automatic. The remaining 20% would be likely to save or invest the funds. So this money too would contribute little to consumer price inflation. And to the extent that it did go into the consumer market, it could help to generate the demand needed to stimulate productivity and employment. For a fuller explanation, see Ellen Brown's new book, Banking on the People, which was published in 2019. You'll find it on Amazon. Of course, in ancient Mesopotamia, writing off debts worked brilliantly well for 2 millennia. As Hudson concludes, to insist that all debts must be paid ignores the contrast between the thousands of years of successful Near Eastern clean slates and the debt bondage into which Greco-Roman antiquity sank. If this policy in many cases was more successful than today's, it is because they recognized that insisting that all debts must be paid meant foreclosures, economic polarization, and impoverishment of the economy at large, unquote. And that's the end of the article, which I think is a very interesting article with a number of interesting suggestions about how to solve the peak debt problem, okay, in our society. I cannot fail to mention, however, that Ellen is here proposing or suggesting that all debts must be paid. But what she is suggesting here in terms of the three different methods of ending the problem, okay, of peak debt is that it is the state who, in one way or another, will pay the debts to the creditors and relieve the debtors of the debt burdens they had. So she's insisting that all debts must be paid, but not but necessarily by the debtors. So I think it's important to note that. Now I would like to check your comments. Michael Hudson is an MMTer. Yeah, he identifies as such. Sometimes he is not always thought of as an MMTer. I see my daughter Devora has joined. Hi, Devora. And excuse me for 1 second. Let me adjust the chaos going on the screen right now. There we go. That should fix it. Now you can just see me and not all the infinity of windows. And Jim Rushford was here. Joe Gomes joined. And Bonnie joined. Hi, Bonnie. Margot Shepard joined. Hi, Margot. And Jeff Ginter joined. And Andy Blair joined. Hi, Andy. Nice to see you. And Randy Hedgebeth joined. Hi, Randy. Nice to see you, okay, as well. So thank you all. Have you any comments or questions on the Ellen Brown article? Susan Eldridge says, he has said explicitly but in an interview that the MMTers are correct. Yeah, I've seen him say that explicitly, that the MMTers are correct. I've also seen him say that he's an MMTer himself. I don't know if all the MMTers agree exactly. He doesn't seem to be at the center of the doctrine. He seems to have some views of his own, which come out of the tradition of the need to forgive debts, old debts. And I think that he's the only one among the MMTers to emphasize that as a policy, okay, of government. And it makes him actually rather unique, okay, in the MMT world. And I say that, okay, in a complimentary way. I think that's a good thing to do. As for Ellen Brown, okay, I think that Ellen has picked up a few ideas from Michael Hudson and from the public banking people and from the MMTers as well. And I think she uses those to arrive at policies which sometimes are useful and have promise. And I think that in the case of this article, that it should be something that governments take under advisement. Susan Eldridge says Ellen Brown is not an MMTer. Yes, she is not an MMTer, but she has been a fellow at the Gonzaga Institute, now the Global Institute for Sustainable Prosperity. And she's read, some MMT over time, exchanged views, with MMTers. And even though she is not, an MMTer, she is a partisan of the idea that the government can and should create uh, the money that is sometimes needed for public policy. As far as I can see, I don't believe that Ellen is an austerity monger, at all. Now, sometimes she may come up with solutions that seem like a stretch, but because she doesn't quite understand the MMT paradigm to the core. But at the same time, she's always thinking about serious problems and proposing solutions that are interesting and worth reading. And that's why I like to consider her articles here. I enjoy doing so from time to time. Are there any other questions or comments? Please share, like, and subscribe. And please become a patron at www.patreon.com/Joe_Firestone. I'll check again to see if you've made any final comments. Okay, if not, I'm going to be ending this stream. And I'll go on now to my second stream of the night. Which is on the minimizers of climate change, who say they think it's going on and are disturbed by it, but find endless reasons to reject Bernie Sanders' plan to stop it. And for that one, I'll be going over an article by Esha Krishnaswamy. That appeared in Common Dreams. So, I'll be ending the stream now. And I'll start the new stream in about 5 minutes or so. Thank you.